When we speak about Islam in the modern West, many people assume it is a recent arrival, something connected to immigration patterns of the 20th century or the visibility of Muslim communities in contemporary cities. Yet history tells a far deeper and more unsettling story. Islam did not arrive yesterday. In fact, it was present at the very birth of what would become the United States carried not by travelers seeking opportunity, but by human beings forced into chains. This single realization should reshape how we understand both American history and Muslim identity in the West. A significant number of enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic were Muslims. They came from regions of West Africa where Islamic learning, Quranic memorization, scholarship, and established communities had existed for centuries. These were not people without civilization or knowledge, as racist narratives later claimed. Many could read and write Arabic. Some had studied jurisprudence, theology, and poetry. They carried with them not only cultural memory, but a living relationship with Allah, one that no physical bondage could fully erase. Psychologically, this reality forces us to confront a painful contradiction. A nation that would later speak the language of liberty and freedom was, in part, built upon the suffering of believers who whispered the same testimony of faith recited by Muslims today. Spiritually, it reveals something even more profound. Faith is not dependent on social power. Islam's presence in early America was not protected by institutions, mosques, or public recognition. It survived in silence, in memory, and in hearts that refused to forget Allah, even when the world tried to erase their names. This hidden history also challenges Muslims today. Many of us experience Islam in comfort, easy access to Qurans, halal food, Islamic centers, and public religious expression. But the earliest Muslims connected to this land experienced the opposite. Their Islam lived without support structures. It existed purely as conviction, and that raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. If faith could survive in chains, what excuse do we have when we struggle to preserve it in freedom? There is also a philosophical depth to remembering this past. History is not only about dates and events, it is about moral memory. When a community forgets those who came before, it loses part of its own soul. Recognizing the presence of enslaved Muslims restores continuity. It tells young Muslims growing up in the West that they are not outsiders to history. Their story did not begin with immigration papers. It began with sacrifice, patience, and an unbreakable connection to Allah, carried across an ocean under unimaginable suffering. And for broader society, this remembrance reframes the narrative of belonging. Islam is not foreign to America's story. It is intertwined with its earliest chapters, written in invisible ink by people history tried to silence. To acknowledge this is not merely an academic exercise, it is an act of justice, because dignity begins when truth is finally told. So the question before us is simple yet profound. What do we do with this knowledge? Memory, by itself, is not enough. True remembrance transforms how we see ourselves, how we practice gratitude, and how we stand for justice in our own time. If their faith could endure the darkness of slavery, then surely our faith must rise to meet the responsibilities of freedom. And perhaps that is the reflection we must carry forward. A faith that survived change should never be weakened by comfort. If the first realization unsettles us, the knowledge that Islam was present at the very foundations of this land, then the second realization should humble us even more deeply. Because the story is not simply that Muslims existed among the enslaved, it is how they believed while living under conditions designed to crush belief itself. Their bodies were confined, their languages suppressed, their families torn apart, and yet somewhere in the silence of the night, faith continued to breathe. This is where history moves from information to inspiration, from memory to meaning. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to think psychologically as well as spiritually. Oppression does not only attack the body, it targets identity. When a human being is treated as property, the goal is to make that person forget their own worth. And yet, the act of prayer is, at its core, a declaration of dignity. To stand, bow, and prostrate is to say that no earthly master owns the soul. Imagine the inner strength required to preserve that awareness while surrounded by constant humiliation. This was not ritual for them, it was resistance, it was survival, it was a quiet refusal to let darkness define reality. Many of these enslaved Muslims prayed in secrecy. They recited verses from memory because written pages were taken away. They fasted when they could, often unnoticed, carrying hunger within hunger. Outwardly, they appeared stripped of everything, yet inwardly they guarded a treasure no chain could reach. And this reveals a profound philosophical truth. Freedom of the soul is not granted by society. It is anchored in one's relationship with the divine. When that relationship is strong, even the harshest external conditions cannot fully imprison a person. But this history is not meant to romanticize suffering. Pain is still pain, loss is still loss. What it does instead is redefine strength. We live in an age that often measures strength through visibility, influence, or control. Yet these men and women possessed none of those things. Their strength was invisible, known only to Allah, and perhaps that is the purest form of strength that exists. The kind that does not rely on applause, recognition, or comfort. The kind that continues simply because truth is worth holding onto. This should force us into honest self-reflection. Today, practicing faith in many parts of the world requires inconvenience at most, not danger. Distraction is a bigger threat than persecution. Comfort is a bigger test than pain. So when we struggle to pray on time, to remain spiritually focused, or to prioritize our relationship with Allah over the noise of daily life, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. What weakened us when so much less was able to break them? There is also a quiet lesson here about sincerity. Worship performed in secrecy, with no audience except the Creator, is stripped of performance. It becomes real in a way that public religion sometimes is not. Those whispered prayers in darkness may carry more weight than loud declarations in freedom, because they were offered when nothing in the world encouraged belief. And sincerity born in hardship has a depth that comfort rarely produces. Remembering this is not about guilt, it is about awakening. Their story calls us to rediscover a faith that is intentional rather than inherited, conscious rather than casual. It asks us to move beyond cultural Islam into lived Islam, an Islam that shapes choices, patience, gratitude, and moral courage even when no one is watching. So, as we reflect on believers who prayed in chains, the real question is no longer about what they endured. The real question is about what we will do with the freedom they never had. Because faith that survives oppression deserves followers who will honor it with devotion. And the simplest truth we must carry forward is this: if they could find Allah in darkness, then we have no excuse to lose Him in the light. As we move deeper into this history, the conversation becomes even more painful, because it is no longer only about physical chains or secret prayers. It is about something far more intimate: the deliberate attempt to erase a person's very sense of self. Slavery, in its most destructive form, does not merely control the body, it rewrites identity. And for many enslaved Muslims, this meant being pushed step by step away from their names, their language, their memory, and even the outward expression of their faith. To appreciate the gravity of this, we have to think beyond politics or sociology and enter the realm of the human soul. Identity is not a superficial label. It is the framework through which a person understands purpose, dignity, and belonging. When someone is stripped of their name and given another, forbidden to speak their language, and forced to abandon their beliefs, the goal is psychological domination. It is to create distance between a person and everything that once gave life meaning. This is why cultural erasure can wound as deeply as physical violence, because it attacks the inner narrative that tells a human being who they are. Many enslaved Muslims were compelled to adopt new religious identities publicly, even while fragments of their original faith survived quietly within. Some learned to conceal belief in order to survive. Others gradually lost access to the knowledge that had once anchored them. Over generations, memory itself began to fade. And this is perhaps one of the most tragic dimensions of the story. Not only were people enslaved, but entire lines of spiritual continuity were interrupted. Traditions that had flowed for centuries were suddenly forced into silence. Yet even here, the story is not one of total disappearance. What is remarkable is not only that erasure was attempted, but that it was never fully complete. Small traces endured, habits of prayer, like movement, echoes of Quranic sound preserved in rhythm, moral instincts shaped by belief in one God. These fragments remind us of a profound truth. Faith rooted deeply in the heart cannot be entirely removed by external force. You can pressure the tongue into silence, but the soul remembers what it once knew. This realization carries an important philosophical lesson for us today. We often assume that identity is secure simply because we are free to express it. But history shows the opposite can also occur. Identity can slowly fade not only through oppression, but through neglect. What chains once tried to destroy through violence, comfort can sometimes dissolve through forgetfulness. When language is no longer learned, when sacred knowledge is no longer prioritized, when faith becomes cultural decoration rather than lived reality, a quieter form of erasure begins to unfold. So this part of the history is not only about them, it is also about us. Their identities were attacked from the outside. Ours are often weakened from the inside, and the comparison should awaken a sense of responsibility rather than despair. Because unlike them, we possess the freedom to reclaim, to learn, to practice, and to preserve. What they struggled to hold on to in secrecy is available to us in the open. The question, then, is whether we value it enough to protect it. There is also a moral dimension to remembering this loss. Honoring those who were erased requires more than sympathy. It requires restoration. Restoration through knowledge, through teaching the next generation, through living faith with sincerity rather than assumption. In doing so, we do not merely study history, we answer it. We become part of the healing of a story that was once violently interrupted. And perhaps this is the reflection that should remain with us. The greatest victory over erasure is not anger, but remembrance lived through action. Because when identity is consciously preserved, the past is no longer only a record of loss, it becomes a source of strength. So the final question is simple and searching. Will we allow comfort to erase what suffering once struggled to protect, or will we choose to remember deeply enough that the chain of faith is never broken again? And when we continue uncovering this history, another misconception begins to fall apart. The assumption that the enslaved were people without knowledge, refinement, or intellectual tradition. In reality, among those carried across the Atlantic were individuals of remarkable learning and spiritual depth. Some had memorized the Quran, some had studied Islamic law, theology, and literature. Some had taught students in their homelands before they themselves were captured. This forces us to confront not only the brutality of slavery, but the magnitude of what the world chose to ignore. One of the most striking examples is Omar ibn said a man educated in West Africa who later lived in bondage in America. Even within captivity, he wrote passages in Arabic, including reflections that carried echoes of Quranic language and Islamic devotion. His existence alone dismantles the narrative that slavery only subdued the unlettered or the uncivilized. Instead, it reveals that scholarship itself was chained, that intellect was bought and sold, and that voices capable of teaching nations were reduced to silence. Psychologically, this realization is deeply unsettling. We tend to associate knowledge with influence and dignity. We imagine that education protects a person from humiliation. Yet here were scholars deprived of both recognition and freedom. This shows us that worldly systems of power do not always honor truth or intellect, and it reminds us of a recurring pattern in history. Moral blindness often coexists with material progress. A society can advance in wealth and structure while simultaneously failing in justice and compassion. But there is also something profoundly inspiring in this reality. Because even when stripped of public authority, these individuals did not lose their inner grounding. Knowledge, when it is sincere, is not merely information stored in books. It becomes part of the soul. And a truth embedded in the soul cannot be confiscated. You can prevent a scholar from teaching openly, but you cannot erase what Allah has allowed the heart to understand. In this way, their patience transforms from passive suffering into a form of quiet moral resistance. Their stories also challenge how we define success. Today, achievement is often measured through visibility, titles, platforms, recognition, influence. Yet many of these learned Muslims died unknown to the wider world. No crowds recorded their words, no institutions preserved their status. And still, in the sight of Allah, their rank may be immeasurably higher than figures celebrated by history. This reversal should humble us, because it suggests that the truest value of knowledge is not how many people witness it, but how sincerely it is lived. There is a lesson here for every generation that inherits faith with ease. Access to learning today is greater than at any point in human history. Sacred texts are available instantly. Teachers can be heard across continents, and yet distraction is also greater than ever. The question we must ask is uncomfortable but necessary. If those who were denied books still preserved faith, what does it say about us when abundance fails to produce devotion? When knowledge becomes entertainment rather than transformation, we risk losing the very purpose for which knowledge was given. Remembering these hidden scholars is therefore not only an act of historical correction, it is a call to intellectual sincerity. It invites us to seek knowledge not for status, but for nearness to Allah. Not for argument, but for character. Not for recognition, but for truth. Because the legacy they leave behind is not written primarily on paper. It is written in endurance, patience, and unwavering belief under conditions designed to extinguish all three. And perhaps this is the reflection we must carry forward. The world may overlook sincere knowledge, but Allah never does. True learning is never wasted, even when history fails to record it. So the question that remains for us is simple: will we treat knowledge as a path to applause, or as a trust that shapes who we become? Because in the end, the value of what we know will be measured not by what we said, but by what we remained faithful to when no one was watching. As we reflect on these lives marked by chains, secrecy, erasure, and yet also by knowledge and unbroken faith, we begin to see that this history is not sealed in the past. It did not end with emancipation, nor did it disappear with the passing of generations. Instead, it continued quietly, shaping realities that many people today may not immediately recognize. The presence of Muslims in America today is often discussed in the language of immigration, diversity, or modern politics. But beneath all of that lies an older, deeper foundation, one built through patience, suffering, and a relationship with Allah that endured when every external support was stripped away. Legacies are not always visible. Some are carried in institutions and public memory, but others live in subtler ways through moral instincts, spiritual resilience, and inherited struggles for dignity. The endurance of enslaved Muslims created a kind of spiritual groundwork, even if history rarely acknowledged it openly. Their refusal to let faith die planted seeds that would grow long after they themselves were gone. And this reminds us of a powerful truth about how Allah's plan unfolds. What appears hidden in one generation may become guidance for another. Psychologically, this invites us to rethink how change actually happens. We often imagine transformation as something sudden and dramatic, tied to famous leaders or historic moments. Yet much of real change begins in obscurity, through individuals whose names are never widely known. Quiet patience can shape the future as powerfully as public action. In this sense, the enslaved believers we have been reflecting on were not only victims of history. They were also, in ways unseen, contributors to a future they would never personally witness. This realization should reshape how modern Muslims understand their own presence and responsibility. If the foundations of Muslim life in this land include sacrifice at such a profound level, then identity today cannot be reduced to culture, convenience, or social belonging. It carries weight. It carries trust. Freedom of worship, access to knowledge, and the ability to build communities openly are not ordinary privileges when viewed through the lens of this past. They are answered prayers from generations who lived without them, and with answered prayers comes accountability. Gratitude in Islam is never only emotional, it is expressed through action. To inherit freedom but neglect faith is not neutrality, it is forgetfulness. To enjoy opportunity without pursuing justice is not comfort, it is imbalance. The deeper we understand the price paid before us, the clearer it becomes that our lives are meant to continue a story, not simply benefit from it. There is also a broader moral resonance in this legacy. The struggle for dignity, equality, and spiritual freedom did not end with one community. It speaks to universal human questions about oppression, resilience, and moral responsibility. Remembering enslaved Muslims is therefore not only about Muslim identity. It is about recognizing how faith can survive within the darkest chapters of human history, and how that survival can illuminate paths toward justice for everyone. Perhaps most importantly, this legacy reframes hope. Hope is often imagined as optimism rooted in favorable circumstances. But the believers we have been remembering possessed hope when circumstances offered none. Their hope was not based on what they saw around them, but on what they knew about Allah. And that kind of hope does not disappear with time. It waits to be rediscovered by those willing to see beyond the surface of history. So when we ask what their endurance means for us today, the answer is not merely emotional inspiration. It is a call to live with intention, to practice faith with sincerity, to pursue justice with courage, and to treat freedom as a responsibility rather than a guarantee. Because a legacy built on patience deserves to be continued with purpose. And perhaps this is the reflection we must carry with us. The sacrifices of the past become meaningful only when they transform the choices of the present. If their faith helped open doors they would never walk through, then the question before us is simple. What kind of future will our faith open for those who come after us? And after traveling through this history, through presence hidden at the foundations of a nation, through prayers whispered in darkness, through identities attacked yet not fully erased, through scholars whose knowledge remained alive even in chains, and through a legacy that continues to shape the present, we arrive at the most important place of all. Not the past, but ourselves. Because history in Islam is never meant to be observed from a distance. It is meant to transform the one who remembers it. The question is no longer what they endured. The question is what we are willing to become after knowing their story. There is a spiritual danger in listening to powerful history, yet allowing it to remain only emotional. A person may feel sadness, inspiration, even admiration, and still leave unchanged, but true remembrance in the Islamic tradition is different. Dhikr is not Arabic, Meme Arabic, Jim Arabic, Rot Arabic, Dal memory. It is memory that moves the heart toward action. When we remember believers who held onto faith with nothing in their hands, remembrance demands that we examine the state of our own hearts while living with everything in our reach. Psychologically, this is where responsibility begins. It is easy to respect sacrifice when it belongs to the past. It is harder to live with sacrifice in the present, yet every generation is tested in a way unique to its circumstances. Their test was oppression and loss. Our test is comfort and distraction. And comfort, though it appears gentle, can slowly numb purpose if it is not guided by gratitude and discipline. This is why the lessons of this history are not abstract ideals, they are deeply practical. Faith must be protected intentionally, not assumed to survive automatically. Prayer must be guarded as something precious, not treated as something optional. Knowledge must be pursued as guidance, not consumed as entertainment. Justice must be supported with courage, not postponed by convenience. These are not grand heroic acts beyond ordinary people, they are daily choices. And in Islam, it is often the consistency of small, sincere actions that carries the greatest weight with Allah. There is also a moral clarity that emerges from this story. Oppression is never Arabic, va Arabic, af Arabic, hot a historical event, it is a recurring human reality. Remembering past Arabic, thought Arabic, lam Arabic, meme is meant to sensitize the believer to present Arabic. Thought Arabic, lam Arabic, meme whether it appears near or far, subtle or obvious. The one who truly learns from history cannot remain indifferent to injustice, because indifference is a form of forgetting. And forgetting, in the Quranic sense, is not merely loss of information, it is loss of moral awareness. At the same time, this remembrance protects us from despair. One might look at the suffering of the past and feel overwhelmed by the darkness of human history. But the deeper message is the opposite. If faith survived Arabic, ha-Arabic, nun Arabic, alif Arabic kaf, it can survive Arabic, ha-Arabic, nun Arabic alif. If sincerity lived under chains, it can certainly live within freedom. The story is not ultimately about cruelty. It is about endurance, not about what humans destroyed, but about what Allah allowed to remain alive despite destruction. So the final movement of this reflection is inward. Each of us must quietly ask, what does my faith look like when no one is watching? What place does gratitude truly hold in my daily life? If comfort were taken away, would my connection to Allah remain? Or has it been built only on ease? These are not questions to produce guilt. They are questions meant to awaken sincerity, because sincerity is the beginning of every real transformation. And perhaps this is where hope becomes real. Not hope as a feeling, but hope as a decision, the decision to pray with more presence, to learn with more humility, to live with more justice, and to remember with more honesty. When remembrance reaches this level, history is no longer behind us, it begins to live through us, so we close with a truth both simple and heavy. Faith that survived chains is now in our hands. What we do with that trust will decide whether their story ends with suffering or continues with light.